Hi, I'm Bruce Bolger. I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and I'm here to host a panel of distinguished experts in the area of employee engagement to get at the issue as to why, despite billions of dollars spent each year, employee engagement is barely budged in the United States and throughout the world, and why even manager engagement isn't that much higher. And there may be some disputes, and I know Kevin has some issues, and we'll meet Kevin in a second, on the various metrics used to describe the level of employee engagement. We all know that very few employees feel the same way about their organizations that their owners do. And what it would be like if all of the employees and other stakeholders had that same passion. So again, just going clockwise here, we're very happy to have Kevin Sheridan. He's an employee engagement pioneer at this long before anybody, practically many people. He's also an expert in virtual management. He's written a recent book on that, and he developed one of the early employee engagement survey products called Peer. We've got Michael Anderson. He's people partner at Anderson Global Talent. And he has an exemplary career, not only as a chief human resources officer and high level management positions in corporate world, but he was also part of the first effort in the federal government to implement an employee engagement strategy linked to performance throughout the federal government, which has survived the last 4 years and is still in existence, to my knowledge, and he'll talk a bit about that. And then we have Rick Garlick. He's vice president of Magid. It is a management consulting company focusing, of course, on people and making a push I see in the area of corporate social responsibility, Rick. So that's interesting. And Rick is also the chief research advisor, or correct me if that's academic, I always get that wrong, but one of the chief advisors on research for the Incentive Research Foundation. So gentlemen, thank you very much. Kevin, I'm going to start with you because I know that you've been at this just as almost as long as I have. Do you agree that we've got a long way to go with employee engagement? And if so, why is that? And then we'll get to what we can do.
Sure. First of all, just to let you know, it not only has engagement not improved, it's actually plummeted. The recent data that I looked at pre-pandemic, Gallup had engagement levels at 36%, and post-pandemic, it dropped all the way to 31%. So not only is it a challenge, it's actually plummeting since the pandemic. In terms of why there hasn't been measurable progress, I think a lot of organizations are not regularly measuring their employee engagement levels through a proper employee engagement survey. And as the old adage goes, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. Secondly, a big problem is that the post-survey action planning that's supposed to be done by managers is terrible. And managers are not being held accountable to put together meaningful action plans based upon their survey results. And in fact, when I ran my old company, HR Solutions, we actually we asked the employees, do you believe that this survey will result in change? The norm on that item was a paltry 33% favorable, and largely due to the pretty poor action planning of the past. And thirdly, and very much related to Peer, which we invented at my old company, it's the personal employee engagement reports. So many companies are doing the ubiquitous employee engagement survey, but they're not encouraging the employee themselves to establish ownership for their own engagement. That's what Peer was all about. The employee would get a confidential report telling them, here are the gaps of your engagement, and here's what you can do about it. So 50% of the solution is missing if you're not doing that second survey like Peer. Does that help, Bruce?
Oh, that certainly does. And that's a great segue actually to Michael, because I'm actually quite familiar with his work. And Michael, you've been a big advocate about performance measurement. How can you add, I think, to what Kevin has said about talking about performance measurement and how that gets the attention of the C-suite and CFO?
Um, yes, measuring performance, measuring engagement, measuring just about anything brings visibility to it, as well as a benchmark for progress. So if an organization is regularly measuring employee engagement, be it employee engagement directly or climate factors that drive engagement, that is an important component of moving in the right direction of employee engagement. So I'd like to echo what Kevin said about the personal component of engagement, and that is effective employee engagement will align both the external climate efforts along with supporting and nurturing intrinsic motivation or engagement. So efforts to create both, sustain both, and measure both are key to a successful employee engagement program.
Thank you. Rick, it seems to me that this has been a field in which companies have tended to throw bright, shiny objects at issues. Oh, gee, let's bring in a ping pong table. Oh, maybe we should have Fridays off during the summer. Rather than applying the rigorous strategic and systematic approach that's brought to manufacturing, liquid transform quality manufacturing, is the real problem perhaps that our CEOs don't get it, that they don't understand that there's an economic value, that people are an investment and not a cost?
Yeah, and I think, if you go back to it, I think there's a lot of commitment to this old service profit chain model, believing that, happy employees lead to happy customers. And while people inherently believe it, they've had a very, very difficult time validating it. And a lot of the reason is exactly like you say, throwing bright, shiny objects or coming up with fun sort of team building programs, these sorts of things. But what they fail to do oftentimes is to understand what differentiates a high performer from everyone else. So a lot of the employee engagement work I did, and I actually began my professional career at Gallup, and was there in the very, very early stages of the Q12 development. One of the things that I learned from these employee engagement initiatives is the importance, like Kevin said, critically important to do effective action planning. Some of the data that we quoted at the time said that 65% of companies, employees said that they were worse off a year later after taking an employee engagement survey than they were at the time. And the reason is because people's hopes get up that meaningful action is going to be taken, and nothing really meaningful comes of these initiatives because people don't know how. For me, the key is, and I'll see my time after I make this statement, the key is, I believe, is focusing not on employee engagement, but more on the business objectives you want to drive. So if customer satisfaction is what you want to drive as a result of employee engagement, there's a whole series of issues that are separate from the issues that you would want to focus if retention or building an employer brand were the key goal of an employee engagement initiative. So I think it's really focusing on the goals and understanding what are the triggers and the drivers of the goals, rather than just sort of focusing on this overall employee engagement score that can be defined very differently depending on who you talk to.
So the impact, and we're going to get back to that with Michael when we learn a little bit about what he did during his tenure during the Obama administration. But Kevin, getting back to what you said about action, do you think that that the CEO, the lack of a CEO belief that this is actually an incremental, this is a contributor to profit, is a factor here? How many CEOs even know the calculation of a human capital return on investment, which is a metric that is actually linked to EBITDA earnings? So is the problem, do we have a leadership problem that we have to address, or this is going to still be a world of HR people throwing around bright, shiny objects?
Well, the best companies or world-class, best-in-class companies on engagement all have CEOs that lead the initiative. That's one of the secrets to success. The other thing is, I mentioned accountability. What we did at my old ubiquitous employee engagement survey, both the manager's responsibility and the employee's responsibility. But when we announced the results and train managers on action planning, we'll be filling out us use the feedback from the last employee opinion survey to make positive change. And then in 3 months, I, as the CEO, could see top down which action plans were perceived as meaningful and who didn't do a good job, and hold them accountable.
So then it's really about having us managers motivated, incentivized, or whatever you want to call it, to take action and to have it managed. Exactly.
And at Gallup, in spite of the fact that they haven't updated anything in 30 years, their research is quite good. And their big takeaway is, if you look at a key driver analysis like the one I did at my company, you'll see recognition as the top driver, career development driver number 2, and the relationship one has with their manager number 3. Well, those 3 things really blend into one thing: the manager. Because it is the manager that should be thanking people and recognizing them. It is the manager that should be saying, where do you want to be in 6 months with your career, and how can I help you get there? It's all about the manager.
And you know, that's such an interesting thing, because you think about it, it's not just the manager knowing how to coach, recognize, and reward, but think about it. They have to make sure their employees are learning, have the right information. They have to make sure their employees feel a sense of purpose and task value. They need to know they need to know that they're engaging with the engagement surveys. Think about what a manager is not doing. And this is a great segue to you, Michael, because we're not going to have time to do justice to what you did, what the program was at the federal government. But you could explain the employee engagement program and how it was linked to performance, and how it belies the effort that, you know, government is not performance oriented, or can't be performance oriented.
Yes. Back in, I believe, the 90s, actually, the federal government linked engagement and efforts to motivate the workforce to performance, and mandated that through the reporting, and gave OMB and OPM the authority to follow up and hold agencies accountable. And
when was this, Michael?
This was the GIPRA Act. And I believe it was in the late 90s. I could have my date wrong, but it preceded the Obama administration. So by the time the Obama administration got in, GIPRA was already in place. What the Obama administration did was to lay out a systematic strategy for agencies to improve employee engagement. As you all are aware, in any organization, and the government is no exception, just because the boss says do it doesn't mean that it gets done. So the Obama administration created a joint team of OPM, the White House, and the personnel office of the White House to sell the program to federal agencies. And I actually had spent 3 years at HUD, and I spent the last 6 months on that team as the Chief Human Capital Officer liaison, selling that program to federal agencies. And so and that linked engagement to performance more directly, and also spread best practices among agencies. The key is, of course, is to have people learning from people. in these efforts, because invariably you'll have some organizations doing better than others. We've talked about engagement not increasing appreciably. That is true in a macro sense, but when you look at organizations, you will see some organizations that are doing extraordinarily well. And so when you peel back the onion a bit as to what those organizations are doing, they're focusing on people. And as Rick said earlier, they are actually focusing on performance. Why are we all in organizations to begin with? There's a mission to that organization. Those priorities reflect how the organization is going to go about eliminating a lot of different things that we're not going to do and focusing on a few things that we are going to do. And employee engagement becomes a means to that end of achieving those priorities and performing those priorities. So we took that approach at HUD. I've always taken that approach. I have 12 plus years of line management experience in corporate America and the media industry particularly. And I realized that when I started HR 20 plus years ago, that HR is really no different in many respects than what the organization was doing to satisfy customers in terms of principles, and in terms of some of the strategies and tactics, and that is you're serving people. It's inescapable. No matter how you view your craft, we're in the people business. And so human nature is operative. And people like to be respected, people like to be valued, people like to be included. And so the more, when you look at what great organizations are doing, they're loving on their people, be it their internal staff or be it their customers. They're caring enough, not just caring, but caring enough to include them, to make them feel like insiders, make them feel like they belong to that organization, belong to that mission, belong to something greater than themselves, and helping them to take ownership of that, to use that opportunity, the organization as a platform to align their own personal mission. Indeed, if they don't have an idea about their own personal mission, to create an environment where they can reflect on those things and even have resources to help them to put together a mission statement or their main thing in life, if you will, to use that opportunity in the organization as a platform to not only accomplish the company's priorities, but to advance their own personal priorities. That is a robust solution, but it is not an easy thing to do, especially we were talking about, it all depends on the manager. A lot falls on the shoulders of the managers, and I agree with that. It cascades down from the senior leader down through the frontline manager, and has to link up with the staff that is focused on their own goals and priorities and intrinsically motivated. So that's a lot of stars that have to align. In addition, Bruce, to all the other things you were talking about that managers have to do. It's a really tough job. It's a noble calling. In fact, a heavy mantle to ask, which goes back to something else you said, and that is you really have to view these things as an investment and not just a cost center.
Well, that's a great segue to what I'm going to talk about now. Thank you. Couldn't have been planned better. Rick, before we get to the last part of this, where we get the advice of you folks to give to a CEO, a manager, or anyone considering any type of engagement effort in order to make a better decision, I want to get at what could be changing. And not just because of the pandemic, but I want to get your gentlemen's view on this. Before the pandemic, we were seeing more and more on human capital management. The concept of stakeholder capitalism advanced by the Business Roundtable 2 years ago. The Vatican has now created a Council for Inclusive Capitalism. Ernst & Young is involved with the coalition for inclusive capitalism with the Rothschilds. You've got BLAD, you've got conscious capitalism, you have the Just Capital, an ETF fund and an outreach group that is way outperforming the Just Fund. It is the S&P 500. So we are really beginning to see a focus in the media anyway, or in the business trade, on people. Is this going to put, oh, and finally, the pressure to publish corporate sustainability reports is exploding for reasons, once the public companies, SEC, I forgot to mention, SEC now requires public companies to disclose human capital to the extent it's relevant to their business or material to the business, and that's an important word. And we believe they're going to be more strict, more defined disclosures coming up in the new administration, perhaps. So, Rick, do you think this is going to trickle down, or do you think this is just kind of a fad?
Well, let me first of all start talking about how our economy has changed. In the 40s and in the early days of the labor unions, we were a manufacturing-driven economy. People owned the factories, and the workers were pretty much replaceable parts. Anybody could come in and push a button or lift a rod or whatever. As we emerged into later generations, we've now really become more of a service economy, and some are even saying an experience economy. So by the service economy, whenever I walk out the door of a company, I'm taking the intellectual capital with me. In other words, the machines are no longer the capital, I'm the capital as a worker. And so therefore, it really becomes critical, to maintain capital, because every time somebody walks out the door, they're taking not only, the tribal knowledge that they possess, but, all of the insights about how to do the job and how to make the company effective. And there's been studies done that have shown that it can take up as much as 1.5 times an employee's first year's salary to replace them. And that's recruiting costs and training and everything that goes along with bringing a new employee up to speed. So it makes really good business. And then, with all the diversity and inclusion aspect that's being talked about so much, it's the whole notion that we're better when we have greater inclusiveness, that the more diverse opinions that we have, the more opportunities we have to look at issues, from all different sides and get different viewpoints. So all of these things make business sense, that given the way that the economy has shifted and continually shifts from being a service and experience economy, absolutely this will continue because it makes good business sense.
Kevin, you've seen this, you've seen a lot of talk over many years. Do you think there's a real change? Do you think there's a tipping point now?
Yeah, the topic of diversity it's interesting because I noticed among my best-in-class clients, they all had a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So I asked my chief statistician to do a correlation analysis to see is there a correlation between efforts on D&I and great employee engagement. And not only did we prove they're correlated, it was correlated to the 0.99 coefficient. And the translation in layperson's terms, if you care about employee engagement, you better care about the diversity and inclusion.
We're having another show on this specific topic, but diversity and inclusion is not a charitable mission. It's not corporate social responsibility. It's better business. And there's so many reasons for that. But Michael, moving on, do you think there's going to be a change? Do you think that there will be, because again, you had an illustrious career. I believe it was at the Discovery Channel, but you'll correct me. But so you've seen a lot of private enterprise and public enterprise, so to speak. Do you see a change coming?
I do. It was the Weather Channel and the Travel Channel.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. Absolutely. The data is showing making the business case. And so we used to argue, we being managers, wanted to have the business case proved. It's been proven over and over again. It not only meets the data analysis test, but it meets just a common sense test. And so as we continue to evolve as an economy and as we continue to face intractable challenges that require imagination more than just problem solving. Not the problem solving is an easy thing, but we have to move beyond how we've always approached things. And so, so absolutely things are changing. And in order to get people's best thinking, especially their creative thinking, their creativity comes from an intimate place. And even sometimes people have to be made aware and encouraged to use their creativity, as sometimes our school systems will not teach that as much as some of the other more analytical approaches. So, so imagination will play a larger and larger role because, as I think Rick had mentioned, we're moving to serve. We're in service, and services being amplified by the experience that we're creating for our customers, and we're talking now about the experience that we're creating for, or need to create for, our workforce. All of that boils down to, how do you make people feel? And I know people will say, well, it ain't about how you feel. Yes, it is, because emotions, we are emotional creatures. We're heavily emotional. We have an intellect, but those emotions can overwhelm our intellect at any given time. So helping us as people navigate our way through how to find our way to living our best life and performing the work that helps us to feel fulfilled, mastering our craft, and connecting with others to help them master their craft, and advancing the organization's mission in a way that everyone feels like a winner. In the private sector, where the engagement numbers are considerably lower than in the federal government. Some of that may have to do with the fact that people have figured out that the what's in it for me is a little askew, that senior management has taken a disproportionate share of the value that's created. And while there's no unified voice on the part of staff to speak to that in an effective way, people can vote with their discretionary effort. And so I think a lot of what you see in those low scores, and scores not increasing, will track the economic development, and that is stagnation of wages, income inequality. And so what I would advise senior management to do is to say, okay, what are the priorities of the organization? And what's the philosophy? Is it does the company have a zero-sum approach? Does it have a win-win approach? The incentives that are out there, the incentives are operative. They will dictate what managers do. And so if you don't look at and audit from top to bottom why people do what they do, particularly your leaders and managers who have, again, a disproportionate, and I'm not saying wrongly disproportionate, but certainly a disproportionate influence over the culture of the organization. So aligning those incentives such that people feel valued and respected, a part of the organization, feel like an owner in the organization, not only from a monetary perspective, but also the non-monetary intangibles that we've talked about in diversity and inclusion, health and wellness, all those things where you feel are factors in being your best self, to be self-expressive, to use your discretionary effort, to use your creative thinking, your imagination, to bring to bear on the big problems that we have today. And those problems are growing in terms of the pace of change. They're coming faster and they're more complex. So we better figure it out, and smarter organizations will. The question will be, will enough organizations figure it out and commit themselves to it to move that macro curve that seems to be stuck where it is?
We don't have much time, but yes or no, do you see hope, more hope than ever, that this concept of stakeholder capitalism, which is pure capitalism. Don't let anybody misunderstand. It's all about creating wealth for shareholders by creating value for customers, employees, supply chain, communities, and the environment. So with that model rising, doesn't that give us some hope that maybe in a generation capitalism will contribute, as it has with the look what Merck is working together today with Pfizer, I believe. Can't capitalism be a force for good? That has to be a quick answer.
Yes, I'm hopeful. I think it's what Churchill said about the Americans, that we will finally do the right thing when we've exhausted all other opportunities. I think that's true of human nature. So with respect to stakeholder capitalism or any other system, I happen to be a proponent of capitalism. And the stakeholder capitalism resonates with me because it's an inclusive model, and it's an experiential model as well, in terms of making people feel like a part of the mission and the organization. So yes, I am hopeful.
Well, thank you. And so, Rick, you know, from your standpoint now, you're an executive, you're a CFO. Somebody's coming to you, they want to sell you either the HR person, some employee engagement survey. They want to bring in a training program. They want to bring in this new technology. They want to bring you they want to, excuse me, change the incentives. What are the questions that people should be asking before they approve anything?
I can tell you the question that I always ask every executive, and I've always asked every executive before I've ever gotten into an employee engagement initiative, and that is, what's your business reason for doing this employee engagement initiative? And I've had some people say, well, I just want to understand employee engagement. Well, no, you don't. You really see employee engagement as some milepost on the way to an end destination. Now, when I've asked people, you know, I've really hit that question hard, and I've asked them to give me the business reason. 9 out of 10 times they've told me the reason they want to do these employee engagement initiatives, and this has been my experience, is because they want to impact customer experience. And again, it gets back to that whole notion of, you know, happy employees mean happy customers. But the things that you would ask if you're trying to drive customer experience are very different than what you would ask if you're trying to pursue greater retention or build an employer brand or drive greater productivity. They're very different areas. I worked for a company that focused on talent selection. That's one leg of the stool. The other one is motivation, an area that I work quite a bit in. And the third is what I call service culture. It's whether the system supports the employee delivering or not delivering an effective customer experience. So it's a three-legged stool, and you have to look at it that way. You can't just say, I want to drive employee engagement. And there's a lot of things that have to do with the way questions are worded and things that I don't have time to get into, but certainly would love to entertain the discussion with anybody who's interested.
So really what you seem to be saying, if I can summarize it, but I'm going to turn that over to Kevin, is first thing, you've got to start with some sort of strategy, some sort of strategic, what are you trying to accomplish? And that's kind of what Michael was talking about, rather than showing, you know, throwing bright, shiny objects at things. Kevin, what is your advice to an executive being pitched on some initiative?
Well, I think they should look at the very real research showing the value of employee engagement, not the least of which is, if you are top 10% on engagement, you'll have 300% more innovation, 44% higher retention, 37% higher sales, 125% less burnout, which has become a huge issue in the workplace right now, employee burnout, and is the #1 reason people quit. You'll have much lower absenteeism, less turnover, which, as Rick was saying, you know, Gallup estimates that turnover costs the American economy $550 billion each year. You'll have much better communication, higher productivity, higher profitability, better safety outcomes, and you'll make more money. You'll make 3.5 times more money, according to this Wharton School of Business, if you are top 10% on engagement, and you'll have happier customers. So start there and just say, what of those great outcomes do we want? That's why we want to do it. And then educate your managers on the value that you just heard.
So Michael, you got the last word on this. How do we make sure, though, when we bring in an employee engagement survey, we bring in one of these different tactics, that it isn't just a bright, shiny object and that it rolls up into performance? What do we do to make sure that happens?
Well, if you're really focused on outcomes, and if you're really, which performance is that last opportunity to influence outcome, everything else is sort of a precondition or antecedent to that. And then you want to make sure that your performance plans are sound, that they reflect purpose, that they align with the organization's purpose, that they reflect values of the organization, that they reflect those outcomes, and that they are measurable standards of performance, that they're clear objectives in those performance plans, and that people are held accountable for that. Again, it all comes down to that individual's performance plan and everything that is in support of that performance plan. The systems, the job resources, the recognition, training and development, all those things that we've talked about in employee engagement and employee experience, all those things really converge in the performance plan. And that's where the frontline supervisor and their hierarchy of their chain of command have a real impact. If it doesn't happen in that performance plan, because the performance plan focuses, and you need focus to move in the right direction in the organization. So if everybody's doing their own thing, or there's looseness in the performance plans, and I'm not saying that is so tight that there's no personalization and such that the job doesn't even look like the job that they're performing because it's contrived, but rather that there's thoughtfulness that goes into it that reflects all those other efforts, and that employee is set up for success. And that's more, that'll keep us busy for a while just to get that
exactly
right.
it. But what's unique about what you're all saying in a different way is that, and this is kind of a summary of what we've talked about. First off, it's a CEO-led thing. At the end of the day, the successful companies have a CEO-led person. It starts with having excellent assessment, having processes that where effective surveys, if some way of gauging engagement. But then it's just as important, again, going through my notes here because I want to give you folks a quick summary of having a strategic action plan, being able to make sure that the people that are getting the employee engagement surveys are actually doing something about it. And the whole notion of the service value profit chain, has that really, was that ever really been adopted totally? Have companies really understood that connection? Well, we've talked a lot about it, but it doesn't sound like we've really implemented it. And so that a really big, important lesson in this presentation today from you folks is having a performance orientation, having what is your purpose as an organization, and having everything focused on performance at the end of the day. But that it's a very complicated element, as we've seen here. Because you have to have accountability. You have to have people, I'm going through my notes here who, and we're about ready to lose our battery. So I'm going to end this now by saying that, you have to have a strategic and systematic approach. You have to have your CEO buy-in. You have to measure results. And it looks like the world is changing and that human capital management is coming along, but we still have a long way to go. Thank you so much, guests, Rick, Kevin, and Michael, and you were all saved by the battery bell. Thanks again.
Take care.
Bye-bye.